Hey everyone, I'm Ian Scott Cohen, your host and personal growth coach. Welcome to the Growth Coach podcast, where each episode I share actionable strategies and insights from positive psychology, self-improvement, and performance coaching to help you overcome setbacks, set ambitious goals, and really just think and feel like the best version of yourself. My goal with each episode is to leave you feeling energized and empowered so you can get back out there and live the life you've imagined for yourself. For more growth coaching tips and strategies, follow me on Instagram at Ian Scott Cohen or visit my website, ianscottcohen.com, for more info about my coaching programs. But for now, let's sit back and dive into this episode of The Growth Coach. All right, so for today's episode, we're going to dive into how we think and how that affects how we feel. You know, if you've listened to any of my podcasts thus far, you know that I care a lot about how we can help people deal with and overcome moment-to-moment distresses, challenges, setbacks. And I focus a lot on day-to-day experience of people, not necessarily like huge, profound concepts, but I want to help translate a lot of the research and best practices that are out there in psychology and performance coaching and other things into digestible pieces of advice and strategies that you can use to just help improve your daily life and help you get closer to living the life that you've always imagined you wanted to live and having it feel the way you want it to feel. And that's really important to me. I think a lot of times we lose in translation some of these bigger concepts, and we don't give folks enough to actually equip them to deal with the day-to-day stresses of life. And so what do I mean by all this? So one of the things that I've always found frustrating, and I'm sure you've felt this too, is, you know, there can be times in your life where you feel like you are rolling. You've got momentum. Things are going well. Maybe you've got the job you want, or you're in a really good relationship, or you're living in the place that you want. And yet, for some reason, throughout the day, stuff can happen, and all of a sudden you feel really down, or you get into a place of sadness, or you feel like things aren't actually going your way when, literally minutes ago, things would be feeling much differently. And so that's really what we're going to talk about today. And I'm going to introduce you to the work of a pioneer in positive psychology named Dr. Martin Seligman. He is a professor at the University of Pennsylvania. He's also the director of the Positive Psychology Center at the University of Pennsylvania. And he is one of several researchers that ultimately their work came together to form what now is known as cognitive behavioral therapy. If you're familiar with cognitive behavioral therapy, or CBT, it's really where, we work with therapists to analyze our thoughts and deconstruct them and why they occur, and then ultimately look at the behaviors that they lead to and how we can adjust our thoughts to adjust our behaviors and just our general responses to situations. And so he has given us a really amazing framework called learned optimism, which I'm going to unravel in this podcast today. And I'm going to give you the tools to actually take control of your thoughts and how they work, which will ultimately lead to how you respond to them and how you respond to things in life that can, as we'll see, lead to a lot of improvements. And so just a little bit of background, Seligman actually started his research with a concept called learned helplessness. Now, this is the opposite of learned optimism. So I want to give you a quick little context because I think it's important. The idea of being helpless is that obviously you feel like you can't do anything, you don't have any help, right? So if you're encountering a challenge and you feel helpless, you don't have a way out, you don't know you don't have any actions you can take to rectify the situation. Now, the idea behind learned helplessness is this concept that, and they've proven this through research, originally with animals and then through research with people, is that ultimately, if somebody or something is held back and prevented from improvement or changing a situation enough times, if you get set back enough, eventually you learn to be helpless because you no longer believe that your actions will actually change the outcome. And that can be a very, very bad place to be mentally. In fact, they've seen a ton of overlap between the thoughts and feelings of learned helplessness and depression. They're almost the same thing, actually. And so this idea of learning helplessness is really it's really dramatic and tragic, honestly. And so that's where Seligman's research originated many decades ago. And they learned that the thoughts a person has affects their belief in themselves and then ultimately affects the actions that they take. And so the way he phrases this is called, they call it ABC. So in psychology, they call it ABC. The A stands for adversity, B stands for beliefs, and C stands for consequences. So it basically goes like this. When we encounter an adversity or a challenge, in other words, when we experience a problem, then that leads to beliefs. It leads to what we tell ourselves, like why did that problem happen? So when we experience a problem, we tell ourselves why it occurred, our belief about that situation. And then ultimately, that belief makes us feel or do certain things, which are the consequences. So adversity, belief, consequences. So when you encounter a problem, we tell ourselves why it occurred, which makes us feel a certain way or do certain things. Now, you can think about that in your daily life, right? It can be anything as small as like stubbing your toe. It's like, oh, I'm clumsy, and then you feel bad. Or, oh, it's just an accident, and you move on. So these things actually matter. How you process what happens in life in your head is what determines how you feel about your life and yourself. If you've listened to my previous series on building and breaking habits, we talked a lot about beliefs and where they come from. And this is a key part of that. Interpreting what happens to us in our lives really sets the scene. It determines our mood, it determines our actions. And so understanding how we explain life to ourselves is super important. And that's where Seligman and others' work in cognitive behavioral therapy comes along. But specifically, Seligman, he studied learned helplessness and realized that once a person feels like they're helpless, they keep telling themselves that they're helpless and they no longer help themselves. Seems fairly logical and intuitive. So then he later asked himself the question, okay, well, if a person can learn to be helpless, then perhaps they could learn to be optimistic. And they could learn to take on life in a more positive and productive way. And he began to research that. And long story short, the research was extremely compelling. So he developed this framework called learned optimism that has shown a lot of benefits. And so I'm just going to rattle off a few of the benefits here. And then in the show notes, I'm actually going to link to a nice little article that summarizes the benefits and gives the references to the actual studies. So learned optimism, as we're going to see, is this framework to help you break down how you explain life to yourself. What we're going to call explanatory style, the word Seligman uses. Okay, so learned optimism has been shown to, it has a ton of health benefits. So people who are optimists have greater awareness of their health. They experience less distress when they're in poor health. They have lower blood pressure. They have lower risk of heart disease. They recover faster. And again, these things have been studied. The studies I will link to an article that summarizes them. And it's really crazy that this is just the way you think can actually drastically improve your health. Other things it improves: motivation and performance. So people who are optimistic have a higher level of motivation and happiness at both school and work. And then they've actually showed that your performance can be improved too. They did a massive study of over 10,000 salespeople with MetLife, and they showed that optimistic salespeople outperformed pessimist salespeople sometimes by up to 57% over a 2-year period. And that's a massive difference. And so again, optimism, this idea of looking at the positives. A lot of times when we think about optimism, you might associate it with being naive or with being oblivious. That is not the optimism that we're talking about. There is a degree of that in what we'll explain, but it's more about, look, you have a choice in how you frame what happens in life and why those things happen. And you can choose to frame it in an optimistic way or a pessimistic way. But just know that optimistic ways have significant benefits, and lead to positive outcomes. And framing things that happen in negative, pessimistic ways have, no surprise, negative outcomes. And they can actually make things worse. They certainly make you feel worse. And ultimately, they make you pursue actions that are just not as helpful. And so we're going to explore learned optimism, and it basically lays out how you can break down your explanatory style, your thoughts, into and look at 3 Ps. So are you personalizing situations? Are you making them pervasive? And are you making them permanent? And so I'm going to go through each of those, and we're going to look at some examples. But most of all, I just wanted to set the scene. This is, again, work pioneered by Dr. Martin Seligman at the University of Pennsylvania in positive psychology around learned optimism. So it's when you encounter adversity, you come up with beliefs, and those lead to consequences, your feelings and your actions. And so we're going to teach you today how to change the way you talk to yourself. So just to give we're going to work through a few examples. So we're going to work through an example of what happens if you fail in a job interview. How do you explain that to yourself? We're going to work through what happens if you're at work and there's delays in a project that you're supposed to be leading. How do you explain that to yourself? And then we'll also talk about a fitness goal setback and how do you explain that to yourself. And then I'm going to close by doing an entire walkthrough of an argument with a romantic partner. That one's very common in most people's lives at some point, and it also can be really important how you handle that and how you frame it. And so I'm going to work through that entire example all at once at the end. The others I'll break down as we go through the 3 Ps. So let's dive into the first P, which is around personalization. Okay, personalization is probably the easiest of the 3 Ps to understand and to implement. It's also the easiest to kind of fake. A lot of this you're gonna have to fake it till you make it. That is kind of how our mind works. And so I'm gonna start this with a quote from Seligman and in his book Learned Optimism. Again, I'll link that in the show notes. So I think this is a great quote that kind of summarizes this nicely. So Seligman says, quote, "When bad things happen, we can blame ourselves," which in parentheses internalize or personalize, or we can blame other people or circumstances, externalize. People who blame themselves when they fail have low self-esteem as a consequence. They think they are worthless, talentless, and unlovable. So I'll pause the quote for a second. So again, he says that people who blame themselves when they fail have low self-esteem as a consequence. Again, adversity leads to beliefs, which leads to consequences. Then he says, people who blame external events do not lose self-esteem when bad events strike. On the whole, they like themselves better than people who blame themselves do. Okay, so again, what we're talking about here is when a bad thing happens, what do you tell yourself? How do you explain that bad thing to yourself inside of your head? And what are those words that you use? And so personalization is one of the 3 things that really are important to consider when you're explaining why things happen. So let's use an example of a job interview. So let's say you are going for a job position you really want, but you ultimately don't get the job. So immediately, right, you start feeling like a failure. You question your skills. You're doubting whether you're good enough for the role or any role in this field, or whether you're going to find a job ever, right? And so when we're talking about personalization, you might say something to yourself. If you're pessimistic, you might say, oh, you just failed this job interview. So you might say to yourself in your head, I'm just not good at interviews, right? And that is internalizing what just happened. So you're saying, I'm just not good at interviews. By saying that, you are internalizing and personalizing this event. And you're turning it into a belief that you're not good at interviews generally, and it's your fault. And so this can have a profound impact on your self-esteem, your self-confidence, and it's something a lot of us do innately because it's kind of the culture we grew up in. But that has dramatic effects. And so when it comes to learned optimism, you want to instead externalize this event. So you want to come up with an explanation that is not personal to you. So you can say something like, this interview didn't go as I hoped, but that doesn't mean I'm not skilled. That doesn't mean I'm not qualified. So this different explanation, again, pessimistic one, you would say something like, I'm just not good at interviews, and making it all about you and how you're terrible. But an optimistic one would say, this interview didn't go as I hoped, but that doesn't mean I'm not skilled or I'm not qualified. That doesn't mean you're giving yourself a pass on maybe not doing as well in the interview, but it doesn't make it inherently about who you are and things that are inherent to you. Instead, it focuses on this specific situation that is external to you. There are a lot of factors when you interview for a job, not least of which the person interviewing you and their perceptions, what things they bring into the room, what other candidates they're looking at. Are they even actually considering outside candidates, or is it part of just a process to get to the inside candidate? Who knows? There's all kinds of things that could be the reason why you did not do well in that interview. But to say, I'm just not good at interviews is personalizing it, our first P in learned optimism. And that can have a huge impact on your personal self-confidence. Okay, so let's look at another example of personalization. Let's say that you're leading a project at work that falls behind schedule, and because of unforeseen things come up, or maybe outside of your control. You feel like your leadership has failed, and so you start worrying about what others are going to think about your ability to manage projects. And so, again, a pessimistic explanation that you personalize this problem says something like, oh, I'm a bad leader. I should have anticipated these problems. I should have planned ahead. This is all my fault. Again, hopefully you're starting to see how you're personalizing the problem and making it all about you instead of recognizing all of the factors at play. So an optimistic explanation of this project delay at work could be something like, we encountered challenges that I didn't anticipate, but I can address them and adjust our approach. So you're looking forward, you're adapting, and you realize that challenges happen. And anybody who's worked on any projects ever knows that. So again, this is stuff that you're saying to yourself in your head. And how you say it really has a huge impact. So if you are personalizing every setback that you experience, that is doing major damage to your self-esteem and self-confidence. So instead of personalizing, you want to externalize. You want to attribute these setbacks to all of the factors at play and not just you. So we looked at if you failed a job interview, we looked at a project delay. Let's look at one more example on a personal side. So let's look at fitness. So let's say you've been working hard on a fitness goal. Maybe you're trying to run a 5K or lose 10 pounds or go after a marathon, whatever it is. You've been working hard on this fitness goal, but after a few months, you hit a plateau and aren't seeing any of the progress you hoped for. So you start thinking you'll never reach your goal and you feel discouraged. Now, a pessimistic explanation of this inside your head that personalizes this problem, our first P, personalized, might say something like, I'm not disciplined enough, I'm never going to be fit. Right? So that, again, it's making it all about you. It's placing all of the blame on you and your lack of discipline, which, again, will take a hammer to your self-confidence and self-esteem. Now, an optimistic reframing of this situation, you could say something to yourself like, I've been working hard and I've made progress. Hitting a plateau is normal, which it is, and I can adjust my routine. And if you listen to my Building and Breaking Habits miniseries, that's actually proven to be true. You actually, if you're trying to achieve new goals, you constantly have to kind of adapt and make things a little bit more challenging. So if you've been doing the same thing over and over, eventually you will hit a plateau. And it's important to know that. So the optimistic explanation here is acknowledging that you're working hard and you've made progress. And then hitting a plateau is normal, and now you just have to make adjustments. It does not say, oh, I'm not disciplined enough to do this at all, which is what a pessimistic explanation looks like. Okay, so that's personalization. Again, the easiest of the 3 Ps, personalization. So when you encounter adversity, when something bad happens or a setback happens, the pessimist will personalize it. And a lot of us do this. And it's important to try to recognize what you're saying to yourself. Are you personalizing all of the bad things that happen and making yourself the cause of all of them? If so, try to reframe and externalize the setbacks. Acknowledge all of the other factors and the fact that you can just adapt and change going forward. Okay, so that's personalization. Now let's move on to the second P, which is going to be, I want to focus on permanence. Okay, so we did personalization. Now we're going to talk about permanence. So personalization was all about making it all about you. and attributing every bad thing that happens to problems with yourself. And we went over why it's destructive. I think it's pretty clear why it's destructive. It's also not objectively true either. Yes, you have a hand in some events that happen, but you are not the only factor. To truth be told, none of us are that important or powerful. Now, the second P in this learned optimism framework by Martin Seligman from the University of Pennsylvania is permanence. And so I'm going to start us off with a quote for this as well. Seligman says, quote, "People who give up easily believe the causes of bad events that happen to them are permanent. The bad events will persist. They'll always be there in their lives. People who resist helplessness believe the causes of the events are temporary." So the optimist believes that the causes are temporary. The pessimist believes that the causes are permanent. So let's go back to our three examples, the job interview, the project delay, and the fitness goal, and look at what the pessimist versus the optimist might say. So with the failed job interview, again, you've applied to a job that you're qualified for, that you really want, you don't get it. And so the pessimist might say a permanent explanation to themselves. They might say, "Oh, I missed this job interview. I'll never get a job." That is a permanent explanation for what happened. And that is making it sound like and telling yourself that this is a permanent situation. This is a permanent circumstance. Things will never change. And using words like never and always when we talk to ourselves oftentimes is not a productive way to speak to yourself, because absolutes don't really exist for individuals. So if you don't get the job and you say, "I'll never get the job," or "I'll never get a good job," that is just making, again, hurting your self-esteem, hurting your self-confidence, and by making things really permanent. It's almost making it like a catastrophe, like this thing, this one instance of me not getting a job means that all jobs will be closed to me forever. Obviously not the case. Now, optimists might say something like, "This is just one job I didn't get. It doesn't mean all my interviews will turn out this way." And I think if you're listening to this, you've probably been through a ton of interviews in the past. Some jobs you've gotten, some jobs you haven't. Most jobs we don't get, and it's because you only can do one job, and a lot of people apply for a lot of jobs. And so it's important to realize that nothing that happens is necessarily permanent. And you have to just find a way to reframe it and make it about this specific situation, this one time it didn't happen for you. All right. Now let's look at the project delay at work. So you experience this project delay. A pessimistic explanation that is permanent would say something like, "This project is a disaster and we're never going to recover. We're never going to be able to finish this." Again, you see that word "never" there. That is a permanent word. And again, it is now making you feel like you have no way out. You are helpless. There's no way to rectify this situation. Obviously not the case, nor is it an option. A lot of times at work, you have to find ways to persist. So the optimist instead tells themselves something like, "This is just a temporary delay and we'll get back on track. This was just a hiccup. This is a bump. It happens," and moves on. Now, easier said than done, but again, this is really important to recognize that one instance of something happening does not represent a permanent situation or circumstance. And so looking at how you explain events to yourself and realizing the times where you say, "Oh, I always do this," or "I'm never going to do that," or "I'm never going to get this," saying it in that way to yourself, portraying the event, the instance, as a permanent fact of life is hurting your self-confidence. It's hurting your self-esteem, and it's not based on actual fact either. So you are actually your own worst enemy here. And you can control what you say in your head. That's kind of the whole premise behind psychology, cognitive behavioral therapy, positive psychology. And so it's important to start paying attention to what you're saying. So let's look at one more example, the fitness goal. So we explored permanence for pessimists and optimists with the job interview, with the project delay. Third example, you've hit a plateau in your fitness goal. A pessimist might say, "I've plateaued and I'll never improve. I'll never get into shape. I'll never be fit." An optimist might say, "This plateau is temporary, and with some tweaks, I'll start improving again." And again, if you listen to my previous miniseries, you know that is actually true. That is the case. You have to adapt. You have to make things more challenging, fitness-wise, to keep your mind and your body, engaged and growing and getting better. That's just how our minds and bodies work. And so, again, you want to find a way to make your explanations of why these bad things are happening or these setbacks happen, make those explanations not permanent. Make them temporary explanations, temporary conditions to explain what happened, and then allow you to move forward and try again. All right. So that is permanence. So we talked about when something bad happens, a lot of times we personalize the problem. We make it all about ourselves and it's our fault, solely our fault. We also sometimes will make it permanent. We'll say, oh, this represents all of what is going to happen. I'll never get the job, or we'll never recover from this setback in our project, or I'm never going to achieve the fitness goal that I want. Those permanent explanations kill self-confidence, they kill self-esteem, and they actually lead to worse outcomes. Now let's move on to the third and final P, which I think is maybe the hardest one, but also one of the most important ones in learning this concept. So 3 P's of learned optimism. We talked about personalization, talked about permanence, and now we're going to talk about the last one, which is pervasiveness. All right, the last P, pervasiveness. So this is about if permanence is about time and whether something is temporary or permanent. Pervasiveness is, Seligman says, it's about space. So what does that even mean? So I'm going to give you a couple of quotes. So pervasiveness refers to, quote, people who make universal explanations for their failures give up on everything when a failure strikes in one area. So if you have a failure in your personal life, then a person who is a pessimist and is making something pervasive, they'll take that personal life setback and they'll use it as a universal explanation for all of their failures across their personal, their professional, their family, whatever it is. Now, back to a quote. People who make specific explanations may become helpless in that one part of their lives, yet march stalwartly on in the others. And so this is about limiting your explanations to the specific situation that you're in, not to all parts of your life, not to things that are inherently you, not to your underlying identity. Sometimes things go bad, things go wrong, setbacks occur in a very specific situation, and that's just what it is. And so it's important to be the optimist and recognize that situations are isolated, they're specific, and they do not represent all of you and all of that you're capable of. So let's go back to our 3 examples, starting with the job interview. So let's say you failed this job interview, right? Now, a pervasive explanation of why you failed or why you did not get the job, a pervasive pessimistic explanation would be something like, I always mess up big opportunities, or I always mess up interviews. Now, again, as I said before, using words like never and always are usually a sign that your explanations are hurting you because they're absolute terms, never and always. But most of life, especially in these types of situations we're discussing, are not absolutes. Each one is different than the one before. Are there similarities? Are there overlaps? Certainly. Should you learn from each experience? Absolutely. But one setback, one negative thing does not represent who you are and what you're capable of. It's just that one situation. So a pessimist would say something like, I always mess up big opportunities. But an optimist would say, this was just one experience, and I can learn from it to improve for the next one. And that is making it so that the explanation is not pervasive. It's specific to this one experience. Maybe me and the interviewer just did not have a rapport. And that probably represents something larger about the company. So maybe it's not a job you're suited for. Now, nobody likes to be told that when they fail a job interview or they don't get accepted to a school. That's when I was applying to colleges. I got rejected from every college I applied to except for 2. One of them was off a wait list. And I remember teachers used to say to me, "Oh, you didn't want to go there." And every time I came with a new rejection letter, they'd be like, "Oh, you didn't really want to go there." And it's like at a certain point, I wanted to go to all these places. I actually filled out the applications for a reason. And I started getting to the place where I was like, I'm never going to get into any school that I want. And lo and behold, I eventually did, and I had a fantastic experience. But we get into this headspace sometimes where we feel like we need to be really, really hard on ourselves and what's happening, but in truth, it's mostly outside of our control. We can learn, we can improve, we can do better, but a lot of times these things are outside of our control, or they just represent a specific instance where maybe we didn't do our best, and we'll try again next time. So again, we're talking about pervasiveness. This is learned optimism, Seligman's framework about how to train your mind to think optimistically, which can lead to greater health benefits, greater motivation, greater success in your career. This stuff has been studied. It works. And so the 3 Ps are the ways that you can analyze your thoughts. Right now we're talking about the third one. We had personalization, permanence, and now we're talking about pervasiveness. And so let's look at our 2 other examples for now related to pervasiveness. So let's say you're back at work, that project fails, or there's a big setback. A negative or pessimistic explanation that is pervasive would be something like, I'm not good at managing anything. This is going to affect my entire career, right? You might think that, this one experience where I mess up this project or we just don't deliver on the timeline we said, now it's going to be a demerit or blemish on my resume. It's going to look bad, or I'm not going to have this opportunity to share a success, and I'm going to be set back, right? That is turning this into a pervasive explanation. Saying that your entire career is going to be ruined because one project setback obviously doesn't make any logical sense when you take a step back and look at it. Now, an optimist in this situation would say, it's just one project that's having issues. It doesn't mean I'm bad at my job overall, right? Again, specify and isolate the situation to the specific one in front of you, to this actual individual instance, this specific project, this specific time with the specific team, circumstances. It does not mean you're bad at your job overall. Now, maybe you need to improve in certain areas. That is on you to try to learn from and improve. But it does not mean that you're bad permanently and inherently and in everything. That is where we go wrong, and we drag ourselves down the negative rabbit hole that we don't really need to be in because it doesn't help us in any way. Let's look at the third one, our third example of that fitness goal. So you've been working hard on your fitness goal, but you've hit a plateau. Now you're not seeing any more progress. A pervasive explanation would be something like, I'm always bad at sticking with things. I'm just not someone who can achieve fitness goals. I'll repeat that. A pervasive explanation of this might be, I'm always bad at sticking with things. I'm just not someone who can achieve fitness goals. Now, you already noticed the always word in there, but that second piece, I'm just not someone, that is again a pervasive explanation. It's saying, my whole entire identity and being is not someone who can achieve these things. That is setting yourself up for failure and killing your self-confidence and self-esteem. Now, an optimistic explanation could be something like, this is just one challenge in the fitness journey. It doesn't mean I'm not capable of achieving other goals in my life. And again, some people struggle with fitness but do great in their professional lives or do great in their romantic lives, or they struggle with fitness at a certain point in their lives. A lot of times we take something a setback in one part of our life, and when we're in a really negative headspace and we'd like to get down on ourselves, we say, because I fucked up over here, that means I'm a fuck up. That is just not how people and the world works. And so it's important to start critiquing the things you tell yourself, because those things have huge power. They make you feel a certain way. They make you believe a certain thing. And so analyzing them and then refuting them when you need to is super, super important. So those are the 3 Ps: personalization, permanence, and pervasiveness. You want to try to find, when a setback happens, you want to try to find a way to make it not permanent. It's just a temporary situation. You want to find a way to explain it to yourself that makes it so it is not personalized, so it's not all your fault. There's other things at work here. There's other factors, variables. Maybe you had a hand in it in this time, but you certainly weren't the only person or thing involved, I'm sure. And you can always do better the next time. And you don't want to make it universal, pervasive. You don't want to make a single instance of a setback as some sort of signal or symbol that your entire life sucks and you're never going to achieve anything, because that's just not true, and that thought is not helpful. So now I want to go and do a full, all the way through example, all 3 Ps with just one last scenario, an argument with your partner. So we're going to do all 3 Ps with one last scenario, an argument with your partner. All right, arguing with a partner, and this specifically a romantic partner, because also any relationship you can apply this to. And honestly, in romantic relationships, it's always challenging to see couples, whether it's friends or other people, get into arguments and then watch those arguments sort of snowball into much bigger questioning of the relationship itself, when in reality, there's oftentimes no need for that. Relationships, oftentimes they either don't develop or they fall apart because each person starts building narratives in their head that are these wide-ranging explanations for why the other person is doing what they're doing. Meanwhile, they're not communicating those narratives to each other so that they can be refuted, so they can be corrected. Oftentimes, the stories we tell ourselves about what's going on in our relationship have enormous power, but are based off of one perspective, obviously, just yours. You can analyze your partner all you want, but that does not mean you know what they're feeling or thinking moment to moment. No one is a mind reader. You might learn them in and out, but you also have to give them a chance, just like you would want to express themselves. So let's look at how the 3 Ps and learned optimism can be applied to an argument with your romantic partner. So let's say you and your partner have an argument over something small. Maybe it's house chores or making plans for the weekend. And then that argument escalates and you start feeling like the relationship is in trouble, worrying that this argument is a sign of really deep problems. Maybe we're not compatible. Like, if she cares about this and I care about that, like, how is this ever going to work, right? If you've been in relationships, you know what I'm talking about. Even in dating, this happens. One little thing can be taken for a huge ride in your head. You can lock onto one thing they say and then just spin up a story about it. And so, going to this example, you're in an argument with your partner, and let's see what the pessimist would say. So the pessimist, when they're arguing with their partner about something like house chores, they might say, first, they might personalize the problem. So they say something like, oh, I'm not good at relationships. I always mess things up. This is why I'm terrible in relationships. So they're making a single instance over arguing over house chores all about themselves and how this is just a sign that, yep, no, I'm terrible at all of this stuff. I was never good at it. And so I can't be good at it. And again, personalizing it for specific situations is a very negative and pessimistic explanation. They might also make it permanent. So they might say something to themselves, we're always going to fight and things are never going to change. This is always going to keep happening because we have fundamentally different views on things. That, again, is a permanent way to explain what's going on, when in reality, the explanation is almost certainly not permanent. It's temporary. It's specific to the situation. So if you do not want to handle arguments with your partner well, then you will do these pessimistic explanations. You'll say you're not good at relationships and you always mess things up. You'll make things permanent by saying, we're always going to fight. Things are never going to change. And then finally, you might say something pervasive like, this is a sign that our relationship is falling apart and maybe we're just not compatible. You might take an argument over house chores to say that you as a couple are not compatible overall. Those two things are not related. Like a single house chore is not symbolic of compatibility. Compatibility comes down to how you communicate. Do you come from the same and share the same values? Are you able to express those to each other? Are you able to grow with each other and learn from each other? And do you care about that process? But if you take a single argument and then try to use it as a sign that you're not compatible, then I guarantee you're going to be lonely for a long time. Relationships are about opening up. They're about growing together. No one is perfectly compatible with each other. People are mostly compatible, and then they learn to love each other over time. You open new doors of depth emotionally, intellectually, and you have to give yourself time and space to do that. And a lot of it is uncomfortable. So if you find yourself taking a single instance like a house chore or making plans, or they did one thing that was a pet peeve, and telling yourself, oh, nope, we're not compatible, this is a sign, then you are actually self-sabotaging. I guarantee it. Unless it's like a very, very serious situation, like a very big ethical dilemma that they did something that you really just go against in every way. Otherwise, it's probably a small problem that, yes, you need to talk about and work through, but is not something where you can start questioning the compatibility and the validity of the entire relationship. That is a dangerous place to be, and it's not fair to you or the other person. So an optimist in this situation, an argument with their partner, might say some things like this. So instead of personalizing it, they might say, you know what, we had a disagreement, but that doesn't mean I'm bad at relationships. Conflict is totally normal, and we just have to work together to work on this conflict, right? And that's true. Conflict is normal. Relationships have conflict. Nobody hangs out with another person for an extended period of time and doesn't encounter conflict. That's just a fact of life. And so the optimist recognizes that and recognizes this is a disagreement, and that we both have a part to play, and we just have to work at it. That does not mean that I personally am terrible at relationships. It's just something I need to work on, and we need to work on together. The optimist will also make this argument a temporary thing. So they'll say something like, this is just one argument, we can get through it, it's not going to define our relationship. And that last piece is really important. I think it's a great example. This is not going to define our relationship. Nobody wants a single event to be what defines them. It's just not, none of us worked like that, and it's not fair to portray ourselves like that. And so if you let a single instance of your partner letting you down or pissing you off or crossing a line, if you let that single instance define their entire identity to you, that is being extremely unfair, and you yourself are not being an open and committed partner. And so it's important to recognize that arguments happen, but they're not permanent. You just have to work through them, and it's not going to define the relationship itself. How you deal with it and how you deal with conflicts that come up is what will define the relationship ultimately. Now, lastly, the optimist, the pessimist in an argument with a partner will make a pervasive explanation. They'll say something like, we're not compatible. Yep, that's just what it is. They didn't want to do the dishes, and they never want to do the dishes, so that means we're not compatible because they don't care about being organized and clean. That is a very big jump to go from they don't do the dishes to they're not organized and hygienic and clean, and that means we're not compatible. Again, a lot of us do that as a form of self-sabotage because we're afraid of going deeper with people. We're afraid of being vulnerable and putting ourselves out there. Totally acceptable and normal. But if you ever want a deep connection, you have to push through that and open yourself up. So the optimist in this situation, instead of taking it as a sign that they're not compatible because one person doesn't like doing the dishes, the person might say, an optimist might say, this is just a specific issue. It's not a reflection of our whole relationship. We're compatible and we can resolve this together. That's what makes us compatible. We can resolve it because we care and value each other, right? And that happens, and chores is a great, easy example because in the beginning of relationships, when you move in together, you start getting conflicts over chores and stuff, but that's just because it's new. You have to find ways to work together, develop routines, develop responsibilities and roles. And it's the easiest thing to do is to talk about it and to decide. I listened to a great podcast once where the explanation was basically like, yeah, look, some people hate to do certain chores and are totally fine doing others. So you just have to learn those things and then divvy it up equally, right? In my relationship, I hate emptying the dishwasher. But I love is a strong word. I don't mind at all filling it up at night before I go to bed. I'm the last person up. I like cleaning off the countertops to keep it clean so it's clean in the morning. So I'm happy to put all the dishes in the dishwasher and start the thing. And my partner, my partner, fortunately, is willing to do the other side of it. She's willing to empty the dishwasher each morning. She happens to wake up before me, and that works out. And so this is just a specific issue. It's not whether or not we're compatible. It's whether or not we're willing to communicate with each other to figure this stuff out and keep moving forward. The optimist views things as, we had a disagreement. Doesn't mean I'm bad at relationships. This is just one argument. We can work through it. It's not going to define this relationship. Conflict is normal. And this is just a specific issue, not a reflection of our whole relationship, because we are compatible and we can resolve this together. So optimism is a super important quality to have in relationships, because you're going to encounter setbacks. You're going to encounter personal problems that you need the support of the other person. And so learning how to do this and analyze your thoughts is really important. So I want to close with a last little segment just about what you can do to start helping yourself becoming more aware of how you're talking to yourself, and then some practices that Seligman and others recommend. So we're going to close out with those strategies. Okay, so what can you do when you start encountering negative explanations? So you didn't get the job, you start telling yourself you're an awful human being, you're never going to get a job ever again, and you always blow big opportunities. So Seligman recommends disputation. So that's a fancy word of just saying you gotta dispute what your mind is saying. The voice in your head does not necessarily represent yourself. It kind of represents just what you're feeling at the time, and then it's trained to just talk. So it'll talk endlessly. You can tell whatever you want, but it doesn't represent who you are. You have to train it to process events in an optimistic way. Hence, learned optimism. And so in order to do that, when you encounter a negative thought like, oh, I'm never going to get a job, well, here are some strategies to counter that negative explanation. The first thing is evidence. So again, if you listen to the previous series about habits, evidence is so critical in all things when we're dealing with our thoughts. So ask yourself, if you tell yourself, oh, I'm never going to get a job, what evidence is there to actually support that negative thought? And is there other evidence that suggests a different explanation, right? So is there evidence to support that you will never get another job? Now, obviously you'll say, well, I didn't get that one. Okay, that's one piece of evidence that you didn't get that single job. But is there any counter evidence? Have you ever had a job before? Oh yeah, I had multiple jobs before. Well, there you go. Perfect counter evidence. Now, a single piece of counter evidence like, oh, you've had 6 jobs before, well, that likely proves that you're probably going to find another one at some point. That's, it's not going to make you feel better all of a sudden, but it'll help. And it's about building up this habit in your head of disputing negative thoughts, not letting them just sit there and get away with being negative without giving you evidence. Negativity is not helpful, and it doesn't feel good, and yet we're quick to jump to it because we like to critique ourselves and make ourselves feel bad, and that's a much deeper issue. I did a whole thing called Feeling Unworthy about that. This is another manifestation of that. So one thing you can do is present counter evidence. So is there evidence supporting your negative thought? What's all the counter evidence? Another thing you can do is come up with alternative explanations for what happened. So you didn't get the job. What are some alternative explanations or possibilities for explaining why that happened? Maybe the person interviewing you was clearly distracted. Or maybe you had a really, really bad night the night before. You're feeling under the weather. Or, they asked you questions you didn't expect because you didn't properly prepare. That can be the explanation. You can be honest with yourself when you didn't prepare or maybe you messed up something. That's not what we're talking about. Admitting when you do something wrong or you could have done something better is not being pessimistic. It's how you explain why that happened, where optimism or pessimism comes into play. So if you messed up, and it's because you didn't read over the questions again the night before, or you just happened to blank because you had too much caffeine or something, that is an explanation that is better than saying, oh, I'm never going to get a job. At least you're giving yourself a specific explanation that actually relates to this specific situation. So when you're trying to counter negative thoughts, you can present evidence. What evidence is there actually for that thought you're having? Is there counter evidence? You can think of alternative explanations. You can also, third strategy, think about the implications. So let's say that the negative thoughts are true. What are the realistic implications? So this is about really disarming the fear that goes with some of these thoughts. So I'm never going to get a job again. The realistic expectations is that, that's very unlikely. And, it's not the end of the world if you didn't get this job. A lot of times we catastrophize. Again, if you've been in cognitive behavioral therapy before, you've probably heard that word. We take an instance and then all of a sudden make it seem like the world's ending. I'm never going to get another job is catastrophizing. It's taking one bad interview and saying, this is the signal of the end of my career. And the last thing you can ask yourself is about usefulness. What is the value of the negative thought you're having? I'm never going to get another job. How is that helping? Is that helping? There's a concept called productive worry that basically states, look at thoughts not as good or bad, not as negative or positive, but just as helpful or unhelpful. That's it. Because thoughts come and go. We have thousands of them every day. You've had the same ones tons of times. You'll have new ones all the time. So ask yourself, okay, I had this negative thought. I'm never going to get a job. What is the value in that? How is that helping you? The real answer is that it's not. It's making you very, very sad, very discouraged, etc., etc. So what would be a helpful thought? Well, I didn't get this job, so I got to apply some more. All right, at least that gives you an action to take, right? Focus on something that is under your control and that you can do today to make yourself feel better, which is maybe apply to more jobs or to reach out for some feedback or to have somebody practice an interview with you again just to see if they have any feedback or perspective to add. Sitting there and dwelling on, I'm never going to get a job, is making you miserable and is not helpful or productive in any way. And so it's really just a waste of your time. And now I know that's hard to shake yourself out of a sad place, but these little things, this isn't about one, getting it right every time. This is about training yourself over time to counter your negative explanations and slowly start turning them into positive ones and optimistic ones. I'm telling you, as someone who's actually used this for myself, this stuff really does work. It just takes practice. It's just training your mind. It's training your pathways and your neurons and synapses, all that good stuff. It's training them to respond differently to negative experiences and to give yourself different explanations that don't undercut you but empower you to keep moving forward. So again, to summarize, you can use evidence, you can look at alternative explanations, you can think about the implications and what's actually the realistic implication of this single instance not going the way I wanted. It's probably not that bad. And then usefulness. What is the value of those negative thoughts? Are they actually helping you? What would be a helpful thought to have instead? So that is, the conclusion of this episode around how to really rewire your mindset through learned optimism. Again, the work of Dr. Martin Seligman, his book, Learned Optimism. He's also a professor at the University of Pennsylvania, the director of their Positive Psychology Center. I highly recommend you check out their work. We went over the 3 Ps and your explanatory style. We went over the ABCs, so adversity leads to beliefs, which leads to consequences. So when something bad happens, we tell ourselves why it happened, and that leads to how we feel and the actions we take. If you give yourself negative explanations that are personalized, so if you make it about you and it's all your fault, then that's a pessimistic explanation. Instead, you want to make it about all of the factors involved. If you make the explanation permanent, so I'm never going to get another job, then again, you're hurting your self-esteem, you're hurting your self-confidence. Just isolate the situation to this one instance. I didn't get this job. That interview didn't go well. That happens. Move on. And lastly, pervasiveness. You don't want to take a single instance of a negative occurrence and make it seem like it represents, your entire world falling apart. That can really lead to a spiral effect. So instead, recognize it was just this one interview, it's just this one time. I'll do better the next time and move on to the next one. Same thing in relationships. You have to really look at personalization, permanence, and pervasiveness when you are arguing or when you are telling yourself a story. This stuff can save relationships. It can also really, really strengthen them by talking about these things and analyzing what words you're using to explain the world and the events that happen to you. What words are you using to tell yourself why this stuff is happening? So hopefully you found this useful. Again, you can check out the show notes for links to Martin Seligman's book and also a quick little article that summarizes a lot of the research behind this and reiterates some of the practices. I also have a blog post that explains learned optimism and gives more examples, so I'll include that in the show notes. But thanks for tuning in. Hopefully this was helpful. All of us can be optimists. It has a huge benefit for you personally, and also it's just a more fun and healthy, happy way to live. So hopefully you took something from this, and we will see you next time. Hey friends, before you go, I want to tell you about one more free coaching resource called The Gas Up. It is my weekly coaching email I send out every Sunday evening to help you get engaged and ready for the week ahead. You can sign up now using the link in the show notes or follow me on Instagram at Ian Scott Cohen to find the link in my bio. And if you forget, you can always find all this information and more about my coaching programs at www.ianscottcohen.com. Thanks again for tuning in to the Growth Coach podcast, and we'll see you next time.